case you weren't there. Just which is from Hobart and William Smith College.
So I'm going to talk about the recent work of the art collective Not an Alternative. And I'm going to emphasize that their politics is one of seizing the institution. Since the institution is a form of collective power, this power shouldn't be further dispersed so as to weaken the collective and leave it vulnerable to capitalist creditors. Rather, the institution has to be taken and used for and by the collective. So Not an Alternative rejects the 60s, 70s critique of power that left the people without it. Now, I want to first give some kind of context or setting for this. Over the last decade, we've seen some of the guiding assumptions of the post-1989 era of radical politics dismantled. Right? So we've seen dismantled the idea that power operates by centralization and hierarchy. We've also seen dismantled the idea that participatory democracy can name radical politics. And we've seen dismantled the idea that there is no alternative to capitalism. Instead, out of contemporary movement, there's now been a new set of understandings emerge, a new practical understanding that capitalist and state power operates through distributed networks and the dispersion of accountability, that capitalist power operates through participationist ideologies and networks of surveillance that reinforce each other. So that's one of the kind of new things that have emerged out of practical active politics. A second thing that has emerged, and that I talk about a lot, is that our setting is one of communicative capitalism, where as we provide information, as we communicate with one another, we build the traps that ensnare us. We disperse our attention, we fragment ourselves, we get caught up in a media cycle where we struggle for attention, where we want clicks or eyeballs or tweets or anything that shows that we're getting attention, that this just reinscribes us back into the reflective circuits of communicative capitalism. And then three, we have in this current setting, I think the possibility that communism names our horizon. This is present in a negative way in attacks on communism, right, on a resurgence of anti-communism and anti-socialism. It's also present in police attacks and radical and collective projects. But the communist horizon that we're in is present also in a positive way in the new force of collectivist political projects like Occupy or the struggles in Montreal, Brazil, Turkey. So we see in this kind of what I think of as a communist horizon, the resurgence of crowds and riots as a kind of proto-form. So I would say that now it's kind of clear that these hyper-individual gestures of autobiography and memoir are tired, right? They're just now a mass form of selfies and so not particularly interesting. So in this current environment of riots and crowds, we have a combining of the imaginary and the real, as Zizek describes it. I'm using Lacan. Right? So we see this combination of the imaginary and the real in media campaigns to heighten fear and stir enthusiasm, right? All again in this attention cycle. The force of many is clear in the present, but what their politics are remains unclear, right? Is the crowd a force of populist energy? Is it a nationalist force? Is it a force of religious fundamentalists? So this has been a challenge and remains a challenge for the radical left, the communist left, which wants to champion the working people and the oppressed everywhere, but the spontaneous politics of the oppressed often seems to suggest something like ethnic nationalism, as well as reinforcement of capitalist desire. Zizek talks about this current environment in terms of the decline of symbolic efficiency, where instead of having a symbolic identity, which is a locus from which we see, we have a proliferation of competing individual identities. And so we have these imaginary identities, and then the real force of capitalism, violence, inequality, and of course, climate. Now this is the setting then for the Brooklyn-based arts collective Not an Alternative. and its new project that I'm going to focus on, the Natural History Museum. The Natural History Museum is it comes out of the climate justice struggle, the People's Climate Mobilization, which is going to be a huge march in New York on Sunday. The museum project itself is part of a larger set of projects designed to attack the billionaire U.S. oligarch David Koch, who makes his billions through the fossil fuel industry, and also sponsors right-wing politics and climate denialism. He's also the major donor to the two most important natural history museums in the U.S., the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. Now, let me say a little bit more about Not an Alternative and what Not an Alternative does, and then turn to the museum. Not an Alternative's work takes the form of installations, interventions in arts institutes and public spaces, and collaborations with community groups. And it collaborates with groups like Occupy Sandy, Picture the Homeless, Occupy Our Homes. These are housing advocacy groups. It's been deeply involved in the visuals and strategies for strike debt, and also larger social movements like Occupy Wall Street and climate justice. For Not an Alternative, the goal of the collaborations is not limited to or confined by the specific intent of the groups it's working with. Rather, Not an Alternative's interest is in pointing out the limits of a given system, and in so doing, using the system to alter the system. And what it wants to do is find the excluded element on which a system relies. So even as its work stems from video, includes video and performance, it happens in museums and on the streets, and includes research and organizing, it's marked by what Yates McKee calls a militant uniformity. This militant uniformity comes from the common, that is, from systems that continue to signify some kind of minimal degree of institutionality in our general setting of the decline of symbolic efficiency. Not an Alternative takes its artistic inspiration from institutional critique, as represented in the works of Hans Haacke, Mark Dion, and Andrea Fraser, among others. Like Haacke, they engage the institution as a network of social and economic relationships. Yet, more than making visible the complicities among the apparently opposed spheres of art, the state, and corporations, Not an Alternative turns the institution against itself. It sides with the institution's better nature, or it finds allies already working in the institution, and it sides with them to work against the institution and build collective power. Suggesting that institutional critique is in its third phase, Gerald Ronig and Jean Ray observe that the concept of institution implies a desire for long-term duration, continuity, and security. They offer the idea of instituent practices. Not an Alternative explores instituent practices as they are not reducible to a desire for duration and security. Rather, the institution is a site of collective power which can be seized. So instead of an instituent practice that resonates with exodus and flight, Not an Alternative models a Leninist strategy of taking the institution. It seizes available signifying modes, reclaiming the communicative common of language, ideas, knowledge, and affect. Right? And that series comes from Michael Hart's discussion of the affective dimensions of the communicative common. So for Not an Alternative, then, this is a politics of organization, infrastructure, and counterpower. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about Occupy Wall Street and Not an Alternative's involvement in that, because we've seen some of those slides. Not an Alternative gave Occupy Wall Street the yellow and black infrastructure. This infrastructure takes the color scheme and style associated with public works like construction sites and highway caution signage. And it puts this kind of very generic symbol system in the hands of the 99%. So rather than a marker left by capitalism and the state, this yellow and black signage points to the people and to what they share in common. The militant uniformity of the yellow and black helped make a collective subject present to itself. It let it feel itself as a force of collective action and engagement. So rather than just a bunch of people in tents or folks hanging out in urban settings, as I think that folks who want to emphasize sort of horizontality, multiplicity, and difference have it, what Not an Alternative wanted to bring out was the way that we've got a collective engaged in collective action. Right? That was the real innovation of Occupy Wall Street, the collectivity part, not the kind of hanging out in parks. So instead of seeing what was happening in terms of horizontality, democracy, and multiplicity, Not an Alternative looked at the occupation in terms of common tactics carried out under a name in common. This was the movement's real innovation. And now, in large part because of the success of Occupy Wall Street, a whole bunch of unconnected demonstrations and protests, right? With tuition increases in Montreal, the destruction of the public park in Gezi Park, foreclosures in Minneapolis, these now seem part of one struggle, right? They're now apparent with the same set of images, slogans, and motifs. Okay, two quick elements of the Not an Alternative strategy. In place of instead of just repeating the prominent critique of representation, what Not an Alternative did was highlight a certain representational fact that was occurring, namely tents, right? The tents were everywhere. So you saw in the images the militants, right? Those are the yellow and black small tents that were glowing from within. Not an Alternative used those both as a representational device, but actually as a prop in various protests, to draw out this component that these aren't just camping tents, right? But the tents were symbolizing an idea whose time has come, an idea that cannot be evicted. Similarly, like the militant, that's what they're calling them, the tents, right? Militants, it's a play on words. Like the militants, Not an Alternative emphasized the name in common. Right, that there's one name, Occupy, which unfortunately is now not so, doesn't have the resonance it did a couple of years ago, but by emphasizing that one name and a common visual strategy, what Not an Alternative wanted to bring out was that people came together and Occupy not because they agreed with everything, but because they were seeing something at work. They were committing to an idea, not to one specific process of sitting around in a park and raising your twinkle fingers, but rather to a common commitment in struggle. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the Natural History Museum. Oh, I get to click this. Oh, it didn't work. And it's still not working. Right, now it works. So the Natural History Museum is this just launched last weekend, right? Like Saturday. It's not an alternative museum. It's not a politics of flight. In fact, we just joined the American Alliance of Museums. And so you can think of it as like a pop-up museum or a museum of the future. And it pursues a politics of engagement, of struggle on multiple fronts within and outside of the museum. And as I mentioned, this politics is one that's connected with the climate justice movement and this kind of general strategy of shaming David Koch. It's part of a general battle against corporate sponsorship of museums. And the way that museums legitimate and enable climate criminals to camouflage themselves as good citizens. So the museum is also a platform for activist struggle. And we have, Not Alternative has a bus that you probably saw just a minute ago. And the bus will go around to different actions. It will also lead trips to mountaintop removal sites, fracking sites, Koch Plaza for demonstrations, and it has a platform that we can pull behind, that can be pulled behind it with performance events. Also, it was just announced yesterday that Not an Alternative is releasing a letter addressed to science museums, signed by over 50 climate scientists, including Nobel Prize winners, and this letter is calling on climate museums to refuse funding from climate denialists and fossil fuel oligarchs like David Koch. Okay, so it's a platform then for supporting a counter-power infrastructure. And the museum uses the legitimating aesthetics from natural history museums, right? Like most natural history museums have a kind of theatrics that are involved in it. Not an alternative, like other natural history museums, uses the pedagogical models of more standard brick and mortar natural history museums, like having expeditions and panel discussions. And it uses the visual presentation forms of natural history museums, such as dioramas and taxidermy. And the whole point of this, other than the political point, the kind of content, theoretical point, is to support a perspective on nature as a commons. So with our museum tours, guides will try to explain what is left out of a particular exhibit. And the bus expeditions will show how is this mountain that's supposed to be part of nature, how is it also part of nature that humans are deeply involved in as they destroy it. And we'll also have camps, summer camp activities and educational projects. Let's see. In many ways, the Not an Alternatives Natural History Museum mimics the Contemporary Museum, right? It uses the same forms of many contemporary museums, which involve a whole system of relations to audiences and use of different kinds of presentation styles. But what it rejects are the ways that the contemporary museum is implicated in capitalism, where there's gift shops, donors, branding, a whole set of activities that bring natural history museums into competition with malls and theme parks. Not an Alternative will, like these other museums, have digital media, apps, and a web presence. But this distributed structure for the Natural History Museum is a way to go beyond the physical presence to show that a museum is always more than its collections. Rather, a museum is a perspective marked by a name. The name holds in place a particular perspective. And what the Natural History Museum is emphasizing is that this is a collective perspective, one that's under threat by the oligarchic privatization of museums in terms of their own interest. So in this way, the Natural History Museum contrasts with what Mark Dion has described, with Mark Dion's description of natural history museums. Dion says that a natural history museum is first and foremost a container for a collection. What the Natural History Museum, produced by Not an Alternative, makes clear is that the museum is a body for a perspective. It's a place where decisions are made about inclusion and exclusion, relationality and significance. So any collection in a museum is dependent on that perspective. And for Not an Alternative, this perspective is collectivity. And the perspective is collectivity in multiple senses. The collective that is Not an Alternative, the collective of collaborators and participants that are coming into the museum. So this whole month of September into mid-October, every Saturday and Sunday, there are different panel discussions that move from the artist Mark Dion and Hans Hacke through various people doing critiques of museum curation practices, to people doing critiques of publicity and communicative capitalism, to local climate activist projects from different groups, which will round out the kind of initial presentation series. So that's a way that there's the collective of collaborators and participants. There's also another collective of the scientific community, which, as I mentioned, has signed on to this letter addressed to science museums. And this scientific community, Not an Alternative, takes as its focus the idea of the truth of science, which is under attack. Actually, can you click? Oh, wait, I've got to click, sorry. And then also a larger collective of climate activists who will be joining in the People's Mobilization and Climate March. Collectivity as common knowledge, or what Marx refers to as the general intellect, which is also under threat from capitalism as privatization, public relations, commodification, and selective scientific funding. Ultimately, then, the collectivity that is at the heart of the perspective of the Natural History Museum is the collectivity of those of the 99%, right, of those outside of the 1%. Namely, it's the collectivity of the people in our habitats and systems. So, again, instead of being built around a collection, the Natural History Museum is built around a collectivity that it also reinforces, strengthens, and that reinforces and strengthens it. In this way, the museum responds to some crucial dilemmas in contemporary climate politics. On the one side, contemporary climate politics is kind of stuck in a sort of catastrophic, devastationist mentality. Paul Kingsnorth is often associated with this view in his Dark Mountain Manifesto. Right? This is the kind of climate apocalypticism that says, okay, this is just all a total calamity. No activist perspective can make any sense other than bring out the disaster that is the climate. And so here, action just becomes critique, which is ultimately pointless. So that's one side of the current kind of climate activist problem. The other side of the climate activist problem is the utopian techno-futurist, which we could put into an equation like market plus technology. And with this sort of techno-futurist, all the cities made of chrome or something, this seems to be a kind of painless response, but it excludes everyone on the outside of the cities, and it also excludes activism, insofar as capitalism appears as a seamless natural system, rather than one that produces, reinforces, and thrives on inequality. These two different climate options exclude collectivity understood as the collective action of the people, right? They exclude organized collectives. You can't see the collective galvanized in political struggle. So what the Natural History Museum does then is highlight this excluded collectivity. So it highlights the way that this excluded collectivity can be a force against corporate money like David Koch's. It can be a force on how we think about the environment and how we see and imagine the environment. I think this is especially significant as oligarchs like Koch have become ever more influential as museum donors, even at the same time as they push taxation policies that cut all public funding. So these financiers exercise a maneuver which is, we will be in charge of public institutions, but then we will cut the funding to these public institutions so that the public institutions are more dependent on their private money. Not an alternative tries to intervene right here by saying, no, these institutions are too important, we have to take them. I want to conclude by saying a little bit about the opening exhibition from the Natural History Museum that you've seen a few pictures from. The exhibition space was in the Queens Museum, which is in Queens, part of New York. And the museum was originally built as a pavilion for the 1939 World's Fair, and then it was renovated and used again in 1964 and has been renovated a series of different times. The opening exhibition was set inside a 64-foot tent, and this tent gave the room, gave the event a kind of sense of being both an exhibition and an expedition. Right? So it was both two things at the same time, or it had the feel of both of those things. Going something, exhibition of the art thing, but an expedition as you would have in funded by or taken care of by Natural History Museum. Additionally, the tent gave a sense of an occupation. Here it was echoing Occupy Wall Street, but on a larger scale. It was a large expedition size scale, so it resonates with Occupy. But rather than just occupying the museum, it seized the very form of the museum, right? Taking the museum form and making that something that is on the side of the collective. I can explain the kind of similar idea by contrasting the Natural History Museum's tent with the Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome. And there's a picture of that geodesic dome up just a minute ago. Right? That's the kind of more typical environmental image. It's been used as a kind of climate politics model in for environmental activists and others since the 60s. In fact, in the 50s and 60s, a whole series of expeditions like the Kabul International Trade Fair and the Milan Triennial and the Brussels World Fair all had their exhibitions in a Fuller Dome because they thought that the Fuller Dome gave a good opportunity for fusing American individualism, global humanity, and capitalist prosperity. Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome gave material form to that idealized unity, easily assembled as a shining open testament to the convergence of art and design in a new architecture of freedom. It not only expressed a vision of the world as a balanced whole, but induced visitors into the proper way to see this whole, a way from which division as such was constitutively excluded. For the Natural History Museum, the tent was neither pure wilderness nor some kind of techno-imaginary. Instead, the tent turned visitors into occupiers. They became part of the collective that was splitting or occupying the museum. They became the people's part of the collective, opposed to the corporation that was seeking to present knowledge in its interest. Right? They became the people's part of the museum against privatization. So the tent was the position of a political collectivity, and it amplified the affective engagement of the visitors, right? The kind of feeling of awe that accompanies being in a natural history museum, and all that comes from a sense of the power and vulnerability of nature. All of these are now in the same picture, right? The awe of nature and the perspective of people as occupying this kind of museum form. Also, you probably noticed, and I guess that's one too. These, the objects in the exhibition were a series of light boxes with photographs of dioramas. And the dioramas kind of are the quintessential natural history museum form of conveying a kind of emotion and authenticity. They're the aesthetic form that are actually most associated with the 20th century natural history museum, kind of hyper-realist, idealized view. They've never been thought of primarily as vehicles primarily for imparting information, but rather for giving a kind of emotional experience or feeling of wonder. I should also add that there's a current debate among natural history museum curators about dioramas and their use. And they're actively debating what the role of dioramas are, and they're actively debating how to deal with climate change. Right? Do the museums should museums take a stand on it, or should they try to be objective, even though to be objective would be taking a stand, namely pretending that climate change was not kind of here and real and honest. Not an Alternative takes a side in this debate, and in fact is now being it's actually being quoted as intervening into the debate among Natural History Museum curators. All right, so I'm going to just conclude then and say that the artist Andrea Fraser has this famous quote where she says, "It's not a question of being against the institution, we are the institution. It's a question of what kind of institution we are, what kind of values we institutionalize, what forms of practice we reward, and what kinds of rewards we aspire to." Against Fraser's kind of individuation or individualized interior, Not an Alternative emphasizes the collective aspect of the institution and provides a museum as a form for a collective desire for collectivity, because only such a desire will be capable of dealing with climate change. The Natural History Museum takes hold of the collective that's already present, redirecting it against that which would exclude and exploit it. And the capacity of this tactic to erode the power of the capitalist state should not be underestimated, especially insofar as it exposes the fact that such power is already eroding.